The city of Elmwood was a stark canvas of contrasts. On one side stood towering skyscrapers, gleaming symbols of wealth and privilege. On the other, a crumbling neighborhood bore the scars of neglect and systemic oppression. This was where the black community of Elmwood lived, on streets where potholes outnumbered streetlights and promises of reform had long since turned to ash. Officer Derek Turner was a name whispered in fear among these streets. A man in his late 40s, Turner had carved out his reputation as Elmwood's most ruthless enforcer of racial boundaries. His record was spotless on paper, thanks to a well-oiled machine of bureaucratic cover-ups. But in reality, he was known for his brutality. Turner didn't just enforce the law, he imposed his own twisted brand of justice. Targeting the poor, the vulnerable, and most often, the black women he deemed easy prey. To him, they weren't people, they were trespassers in his city. Sarah Evans was no ordinary elderly woman. To the outside world, she was a frail, unassuming figure dressed in thrift store clothes that hung loosely over her small frame. Her hair was streaked with gray, her hands worn from years of labor, and her smile radiated warmth. But her unremarkable appearance belied the fierce spirit within her, a spirit forged in the fires of segregation and injustice. Sarah had lived a life of quiet privilege as the mother of Judge Marcus Evans, one of the city's most respected legal minds. Yet, wealth had never blinded her to the suffering of her people. For decades, she had devoted herself to helping the black community, slipping into the poorest neighborhoods disguised as just another struggling woman. Sarah didn't want gratitude or recognition. She wanted change. She wanted hope. On the day it happened, Sarah was doing what she always did, delivering food, blankets, and kind words to families in need. She moved through the streets like a shadow, her bag slung over her shoulder, her heart heavy with the burdens of others. As she approached the edge of the district, where Elmwood's wealth bled into its poverty, she saw him, Officer Derek Turner. Turner's patrol car screeched to a halt beside her. He stepped out with the slow, deliberate swagger of a predator circling its prey. Sarah didn't flinch as he approached. She had encountered his kind before, men drunk on power and hate. But this time was different. "Hey," Turner barked, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "What are you doing here?" Sarah turned, her calm eyes meeting his. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through?" Turner sneered. "This isn't your kind of place. Old woman, we don't need your kind loitering around here." Sarah's voice remained steady, though her heart quickened. "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm helping people." Turner stepped closer, his face twisting with disdain. "Helping? You think anyone here cares about your pity? This is my street, and I say who stays and who goes." A small crowd began to gather at a distance, their eyes darting nervously between Sarah and Turner. No one dared intervene. They knew what Turner was capable of. When Sarah refused to back down, Turner's patience snapped. "I said, get out of here," he roared, his hand shoving her shoulder. Sarah stumbled but stood her ground. "You don't scare me," she said softly, her words a quiet defiance. It was the breaking point. Turner's fist flew before anyone could stop him, landing squarely on Sarah's cheek. The force sent her crumpling to the ground, her bag spilling its contents, a loaf of bread, a blanket, a bottle of water. Gasps erupted from the onlookers. A child cried out, but Turner wasn't done. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "Stay down," he growled, his voice thick with rage. Sarah was rushed to the hospital by frightened witnesses who finally found the courage to act after Turner left the scene. Her injuries were severe, a fractured cheekbone, bruised ribs, and a concussion. Yet, as she lay unconscious in the emergency room, she remained unaware of the storm her attack had unleashed. News of the incident spread like wildfire, reaching Judge Marcus Evans within hours. He was in the middle of a trial when his assistant whispered the news into his ear. His usually calm demeanor shattered as he stood abruptly, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "My mother?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "Are you sure?" The assistant nodded. "She's at Elmwood General. It's bad." Marcus's heart pounded as he raced to the hospital, his mind replaying the image of his mother, the woman who had raised him with love and strength, lying broken on a cold city street. When he arrived, the sight of her battered face brought tears to his eyes. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with resolve. "This won't stand," he vowed. "Not this time." As Marcus dug deeper into the attack, he uncovered layers of corruption that ran deeper than he had imagined. Witnesses came forward with tales of Turner's reign of terror: women beaten, families threatened, lives destroyed. Each story added fuel to Marcus's growing determination to bring Turner to justice. But there was something else. Among Sarah's spilled belongings, a child had found a handwritten letter addressed to Marcus. It was a letter Sarah had never intended him to see. A confession of sorts. In it, she wrote about her fear of dying before seeing the world change for her people. She wrote about her pride in Marcus and her hope that he would use his position to fight for justice, not just for her, but for everyone. The letter became a rallying cry, not just for Marcus but for the entire community. As word spread, people began to gather outside the hospital, holding signs, singing songs, and demanding accountability. For the first time, Elmwood's poorest residents saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to stand up to the man who had terrorized them for so long. Elmwood wasn't just a city, it was a reflection of a broken system. On the north side, glass towers pierced the sky, their shadows stretching over manicured parks and bustling cafes. Meanwhile, the south side was a different world, a labyrinth of crumbling tenements and forgotten dreams. Here, time moved differently, each day burdened by the weight of survival. For decades, promises of progress had come and gone, leaving only widening cracks in the asphalt and the hearts of its residents. Officer Derek Turner ruled this neglected corner of the city with an iron fist. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the smugness of a man who believed himself untouchable. Turner's badge was his shield, but his true weapon was fear. His victims were those who couldn't fight back: single mothers, the elderly, the homeless. His prey, each bruise he left behind was a silent warning: you're on your own here. But something Turner never understood was the quiet strength of the people he tormented. Behind every wary glance and whispered complaint was a resilience that couldn't be broken. And in Sarah Evans, he would soon meet a force he was wholly unprepared for. Sarah Evans walked the streets of South Elmwood as if she were part of the pavement itself, familiar, unassuming, constant. To the world, she was just another aging black woman, her second-hand clothes and sturdy boots blending into the backdrop of poverty. But to the people she touched, Sarah was a lifeline. Her days began early, often before the sun rose. As she prepared food parcels in her modest kitchen, she packed bags of donated clothes, toiletries, and small toys for children. It wasn't just charity, it was solidarity. Sarah had lived through Jim Crow and seen the civil rights movement firsthand. She knew change didn't come from waiting, it came from action. On the morning of the incident, Sarah felt the familiar ache in her knees as she climbed the steps of the neighborhood center. Her bag was heavier than usual, stuffed with blankets she had spent the previous night sewing. As she walked the streets, she stopped to chat with mothers on their way to work, gave directions to a boy clutching a torn backpack, and slipped a few bills into the hands of a man huddled against the cold. By the time she reached the edge of the district, Sarah's energy was waning, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had one last stop to make: a single mother struggling to care for her 3 children. The route took her past an invisible border, the unspoken line separating the neglected South from the affluent North. That was where she saw him, Derek Turner. Turner spotted Sarah immediately, his predatory gaze narrowing on her frail figure. She was an easy target, or so he thought. He pulled his patrol car onto the curb, the tires screeching loudly enough to draw the attention of passers-by. Sarah stopped mid-step, her body stiffening as the officer approached. "Where do you think you're going?" Turner's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the street. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Just passing through," she said, her voice steady despite the unease growing in her chest. Turner's smirk widened. "Passing through? This isn't a free-for-all. You don't belong here." Sarah straightened her shoulders, her eyes meeting his with quiet defiance. "I belong wherever I choose to walk. This is a public street, officer." The exchange caught the attention of a small group of onlookers: shopkeepers, children playing nearby, a woman pushing a stroller. They froze in place, their eyes darting between Sarah and Turner. Everyone knew what could happen next. Turner stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Sarah. "Listen, lady, I'm not in the mood for your attitude. You've got 5 seconds to turn around and head back where you came from." Sarah didn't flinch. "And what if I don't?" The slap of Turner's hand against her shoulder was forceful, meant to intimidate. Sarah stumbled back but caught herself. She didn't say a word. Her silence only enraged him further. Before anyone could process what was happening, Turner's fist shot out, striking Sarah square in the face. She crumpled to the ground, her bag spilling open, loaves of bread, a few cans of soup, and a tattered blanket tumbling onto the pavement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A young boy clung to his mother's leg, his wide eyes brimming with fear. The woman with the stroller quickly wheeled her child away, her heart pounding in her chest. But no one moved to help. Turner's reputation was too fearsome. Sarah lay motionless for a moment, the pain radiating through her cheekbone. Her head throbbed, but she refused to cry out. Slowly, she propped herself up on one elbow, her gaze locking with Turner's. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Turner laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Get used to it, old lady. No one's coming to save you." After Turner drove off, a group of hesitant onlookers rushed to Sarah's side. They lifted her gently, murmuring reassurances even as fear lingered in their voices. Someone called an ambulance, and within minutes, Sarah was being loaded onto a stretcher, her face pale but determined. At the hospital, word of the attack began to spread. Cell phone footage taken by a teenager at the scene circulated online, quickly garnering attention. The grainy video showed the punch, the crowd's shock, and Sarah lying on the ground. It was enough to ignite outrage. When Judge Marcus Evans received the call, he was in the middle of a hearing. The words hit him like a blow. "Your mother's been attacked. It's serious. She's in the hospital." Marcus's usually composed demeanor cracked. He left the courthouse immediately, his thoughts racing as he drove to Elmwood General. When he arrived, the sight of his mother, her face swollen and bruised, her hand clutching a thin hospital blanket, brought tears to his eyes. He knelt beside her bed, his hand covering hers. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. Sarah's lips curled into a weak smile. "The same man who's done it to so many others." Her words were a dagger. Marcus had spent years fighting for justice within the confines of the courtroom, believing in the power of the law. But now, the violence he had worked so hard to combat had reached his own family. It wasn't just personal, it was war. That night, as Marcus sat by his mother's bedside, his phone buzzed with messages and calls. Activists, journalists, and community leaders were already rallying. The video of the attack had gone viral, sparking outrage not just in Elmwood but across the country. Protesters began gathering outside the hospital, their chants echoing through the night. "Justice for Sarah. Justice for Elmwood." Meanwhile, Turner was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Sitting in his patrol car, he scrolled through his phone, confident that his actions would, as always, go unpunished. What he didn't know was that Marcus had already begun building a case that would expose not just Turner, but the entire system that had protected him. The attack on Sarah Evans didn't end with the bruises on her face or the pain in her ribs. It rippled through Elmwood like a shockwave. The people of South Elmwood had endured decades of injustice. But this, an elderly woman attacked in broad daylight, was the final straw. It wasn't just Sarah they saw lying on the pavement, it was their mothers, their grandmothers, their sisters. Her pain became their pain, her humiliation their shared burden. Outside the hospital, the small gathering of protesters swelled by the hour. Mothers with children in tow held signs reading, "Justice for Sarah." Young men and women, emboldened by the viral video, chanted, "No more fear, no more Turner." By nightfall, the hospital parking lot was packed, the air electric with righteous anger. Local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing the growing movement. Inside, Sarah was unaware of the commotion. The sedatives had dulled the worst of her pain. But even in her sleep, her brow furrowed as if she were still fighting unseen battles. Marcus sat beside her, his phone buzzing relentlessly with updates and messages from allies and colleagues. "Judge Evans," said a familiar voice from the doorway. Marcus looked up to see Leonard Hayes, an old friend and seasoned civil rights attorney. "Leonard," Marcus said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Thank you for coming." Leonard stepped closer, his expression grim. "I saw the video. This isn't just another case of police brutality. Marcus, this is a reckoning." Marcus nodded, Turner picked the wrong person this time. But it's not just about my mother. This is about everyone he's terrorized. Leonard placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Then let's make sure we do this right. We can't just take him down. We have to take down the system that let him thrive. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Turner lounged in his apartment, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing outside his small bubble of privilege. He leaned back on his couch, a beer in one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other. The day's events barely registered as a blip on his radar. To him, it was just another routine assertion of dominance. He had done worse before, and nothing had ever come of it. Turner laughed as he skimmed through his text messages. His fellow officers had sent their usual comments of approval. Nice work keeping the streets clean. That old bat had it coming. But Turner didn't realize the world outside his echo chamber was changing. The video of his assault on Sarah had reached not just Elmwood but the national news cycle. Celebrities were tweeting about it. Activist groups were mobilizing. Even the mayor's office, usually silent on such matters, issued a carefully worded statement condemning any and all acts of police misconduct. Turner's first inkling that something was wrong came when his phone rang. It was his supervisor at the precinct. "Turner," the voice on the other end barked. "We've got a problem. That woman you roughed up, her son's a goddamn judge." Turner's smirk faltered. "What does that have to do with me? She was trespassing." "She wasn't trespassing, you idiot. She was delivering food to a single mom. And now there's a mob outside the hospital. Reporters everywhere. And the mayor breathing down my neck. You'd better hope this blows over. Or you're on your own." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into Turner's mind. But it was quickly smothered by years of arrogance. He'd weathered storms before. This would be no different, or so he thought as the protests outside the hospital grew louder. Marcus knew he couldn't afford to wait. His mother was stable, but the fire inside him was burning out of control. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, believing in its power to deliver justice. But now, that belief was being tested. Sitting by Sarah's bedside, Marcus replayed her whispered words. "You'll regret this." Those words weren't just meant for Turner. They were meant for everyone who allowed men like Turner to thrive, the silent bystanders, the complicit enablers, the system itself. Marcus stood abruptly, startling Leonard, who was typing notes on his tablet. "We're going to need everything," Marcus said. "Witnesses, records, complaints, anything and everything tied to Turner. If we're going after him, we're going all the way." Leonard grinned. "Now you're talking. But you know this won't be easy. Turner's protected, and you're going to make a lot of enemies." "I don't care," Marcus said firmly. "He attacked my mother. He's attacked countless others. It's time someone fought back." As the days passed, the energy in Elmwood reached a fever pitch. Turner's past victims began stepping forward, their stories adding fuel to the fire. A single mother tearfully recounted how Turner had harassed her for months, threatening to take her children away if she didn't show respect. An elderly man described being beaten by Turner for sitting on a park bench too long. Each story was more horrifying than the last, but together, they painted a picture of a predator who had operated unchecked for years. And for the first time, the people of South Elmwood began to see the possibility of change. Community leaders organized town halls, inviting residents to share their experiences. Social media campaigns spread like wildfire, with hashtags like #Justice for Sarah and #Turner Must Fall trending nationwide. The movement grew beyond Elmwood, attracting attention from civil rights organizations and high-profile activists in the quiet moments between the chaos. Marcus returned to his mother's hospital room. Sarah was awake now, her face still swollen but her eyes sharp and clear. She watched him as he paced the room, his mind racing with strategies and plans. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice drawing him to a stop. "Come sit." He obeyed. Sitting beside her bed, she reached for his hand, her touch warm and steady. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've already done so much." Marcus shook his head. "I can't let this go. Mom, not after what he did to you. Not after what he's done to so many others." Sarah smiled faintly. "You've always been strong, even as a little boy. You stood up for what was right. But remember, this isn't just about Turner. It's about the system that made him possible. Don't lose sight of the bigger fight." Her words settled over him like a mantle of responsibility. Marcus squeezed her hand. "I won't, I promise." The protests reached their peak on the fifth night. Thousands of people flooded the streets, their chants echoing through the city. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating a sea of determined faces. The mayor called an emergency press conference, vowing to launch an independent investigation into Turner's actions. But Marcus knew investigations weren't enough. He had already begun preparing his case, a case that would not only bring Turner to justice but expose the system that had shielded him for so long. As he stood on the hospital steps, looking out at the crowd, Marcus felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a fight for his mother. It was a fight for all of them. The courtroom was Marcus Evans' domain, a place where he had always believed justice could be served. But as he reviewed the evidence of his mother's attack, he felt a chill run through him. This case wasn't just about one act of violence. It was about years, decades, of unchecked abuse by Derek Turner and men like him. It was about dismantling a system that allowed such men to thrive. Marcus began by assembling a team, a coalition of individuals who shared his vision of justice. Leonard Hayes, his longtime friend and a civil rights lawyer with a sharp tongue and sharper instincts, was his first call. Next came Jasmine Carter, a young and fiery journalist who had made a name for herself exposing corruption in Elmwood. Finally, there was Timothy Nguyen, a former police officer who had left the force after witnessing the culture of silence that protected men like Turner. "This won't be easy," Leonard warned during their first strategy meeting. "Turner's been in the game a long time. He's got friends in high places." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Then we'll go higher. If the system protects him, we'll take on the system." Jasmine's first task was to dig into Turner's past. And what she uncovered was worse than they had imagined. Turner's personnel file was a web of contradictions, glowing performance reviews alongside dozens of citizen complaints, most of which had mysteriously disappeared. There were whispers of payoffs, threats, and cover-ups. A single mother, now relocated to another state, recounted how Turner had extorted her for months. An elderly shopkeeper spoke of a mysterious fire that had destroyed his store after he refused to pay Turner protection money. These stories painted a picture of a man who had not only abused his power but had built an empire of fear within Elmwood. But the most damning evidence came from Timothy Nguyen. After weeks of hesitation, he finally agreed to go on record, recounting how Turner had once bragged about assaulting a homeless man and framing him for theft. "They don't matter," Turner had said. "Nobody cares what happens to them." Timothy's voice cracked as he recounted the incident to Marcus. "I should have spoken up then. But I was scared. They protect their own." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Timothy's shoulder. "You're speaking up now. That's what matters." While Marcus and his team worked behind the scenes, the people of Elmwood were making their voices heard. The protests outside the hospital had transformed into a full-blown movement. Local artists painted murals of Sarah Evans, depicting her as a symbol of resilience. Churches held vigils, their pews packed with people praying for justice. But the movement wasn't without its challenges. Turner's supporters, many of whom were officers or their families, launched a counter-campaign, painting him as a misunderstood hero. They claimed he had only acted in self-defense, despite the clear evidence to the contrary. Anonymous threats began flooding Marcus's office, warning him to drop the case. One night, as Marcus left his office, he found his car vandalized. The words, "traitor," were scrawled across the windshield in red spray paint. Leonard found him staring at the car, his jaw tight. "They're trying to scare you," Leonard said. "Don't let them." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let them come. I'm not stopping." The trial of Derek Turner was unlike anything Elmwood had ever seen. The courtroom was packed, with crowds spilling into the hallways and reporters jostling for space. Marcus, though not the prosecuting attorney, sat front and center, his presence a reminder of the stakes. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, recounting the events of Sarah's attack and framing it as part of a larger pattern of abuse. They called witness after witness, each one recounting their own harrowing encounters with Turner. The elderly man who had been beaten, the mother who had been extorted, the shopkeeper who had lost everything. Their stories were raw and heart-wrenching, painting Turner as a man who thrived on the suffering of others. But the defense fought back viciously. Turner's lawyer, a seasoned trial attorney named Charles Whitaker, was ruthless in his cross-examinations. He painted the witnesses as unreliable, their stories as exaggerated or fabricated. He tried to portray Sarah Evans as a meddlesome woman who had provoked Turner. When Sarah herself took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Despite her injuries, she spoke with clarity and conviction. She recounted the day of the attack, her voice steady even as her son watched with tears in his eyes. "I've seen men like Derek Turner my whole life," she said. "They think their power makes them untouchable. But they're wrong. No one is untouchable." Outside the courtroom, tensions were at a breaking point. Protesters clashed with Turner's supporters, and police were called in to maintain order. Marcus received daily updates on the movement, but his focus remained on the trial. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every argument brought them closer to exposing the truth. But just as things seemed to be turning in their favor, an unexpected twist threatened to derail the case. The defense produced a doctored video that appeared to show Sarah acting aggressively toward Turner before the attack. Though quickly debunked, the video sowed doubt in the minds of some jurors. Marcus was furious. How could they even present something so obviously fake? Leonard sighed. Because they're desperate. And desperate men do desperate things. The turning point came during Timothy Nguyen's testimony. Speaking publicly for the first time, Timothy described the culture of fear and corruption within the Elmwood Police Department. He spoke of officers who turned a blind eye, of supervisors who dismissed complaints, of a system designed to protect men like Turner at all costs. "Derek Turner isn't an anomaly," Timothy said, his voice steady. "He's a symptom. If we want real change, we have to tear the system down and rebuild it." His words electrified the courtroom, leaving even the defense momentarily stunned. The prosecution seized the momentum, presenting a closing argument that left no doubt about Turner's guilt after weeks of testimony. The jury reached a verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the foreman stood to deliver it. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Turner sat frozen, his face pale, as his supporters scrambled to process the news. Outside, the cheers of protesters echoed through the streets. Justice, at long last, had been served. Marcus sat in his office late into the night, surrounded by stacks of files and folders, his desk a battlefield of paper trails and evidence. The case against Derek Turner wasn't just a legal battle, it was a moral reckoning. Each document told a story of pain and injustice, and Marcus felt the weight of every victim who had suffered under Turner's reign. The team worked tirelessly, piecing together a timeline of Turner's actions. Leonard Hayes spearheaded the legal strategy, crafting a powerful argument that exposed Turner's systemic abuse of power. Jasmine Carter, the journalist, provided critical insights into how the police department had shielded Turner from accountability. Timothy Nguyen, the former cop, became the team's moral compass, offering an insider's perspective on the culture of silence within the force. One evening, Jasmine burst into Marcus's office, clutching a manila folder. "You need to see this," she said, slamming it on his desk. Inside were internal memos from the Elmwood Police Department. They showed a pattern of complaints against Turner that had been dismissed without investigation. Attached was a confidential letter from Turner's former supervisor, warning that his behavior was becoming a liability. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read. They knew exactly who he was. And they did nothing. Jasmine nodded. "This isn't just about Turner. It's about the entire system that enabled him. Then we'll hold them all accountable," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "No more hiding." As Marcus's team delved deeper, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. Turner wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a larger disease. Jasmine's investigative work uncovered a network of corruption within the Elmwood Police Department. Officers routinely falsified reports, suppressed evidence, and targeted marginalized communities to inflate arrest numbers. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from an anonymous whistleblower within the department. The informant provided audio recordings of Turner bragging about his power. "They think they can fight back?" Turner's voice sneered on the recording. "Let them try. I've got friends in high places. Nobody's touching me." The recordings were a bombshell. Marcus's team leaked them to the press, sparking outrage nationwide. The story dominated headlines, with Turner becoming the face of police brutality and corruption. But the backlash was swift. Marcus received a barrage of threats, his phone ringing incessantly with anonymous calls. One night, a brick shattered the window of his office. A crude note attached. Drop the case. Or else. Leonard found Marcus staring at the broken glass the next morning. You okay? Marcus nodded, his expression steely. Let them try to scare me. I'm not backing down. The courtroom was a crucible. Its pews filled with a volatile mix of protesters, supporters, and media. The air was thick with tension as the judge called the court to order. Derek Turner sat at the defense table, his face impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. He was no longer the untouchable figure he once believed himself to be. The prosecution, led by a fiery young attorney named Rebecca Diaz, opened with a blistering statement. This case is not just about Derek Turner, she said, her voice firm. It's about a system that has allowed men like him to operate with impunity. Today, we begin to dismantle that system. Rebecca called Sarah Evans as her first witness. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah took the stand, her frail frame a stark contrast to the strength in her voice. She recounted the day of the attack with unwavering clarity, describing the moment Turner's fist connected with her face. He didn't just hit me, she said, her voice breaking. He hit every person who's ever been told they don't belong. But I do belong, and I'm here to say that no one should ever feel like they don't. The defense, led by the shrewd and calculating Charles Whitaker, attempted to discredit her. He questioned her motives, insinuating that she had provoked Turner. But Sarah remained composed, her quiet dignity silencing even the most cynical observers as the trial progressed. The prosecution presented a parade of witnesses who had suffered under Turner's brutality. Each story was more harrowing than the last. A young black man described being beaten and left for dead by Turner during a traffic stop. A teenage girl wept as she recounted how Turner had threatened her family if they filed a complaint. But the defense was relentless. Whitaker employed every tactic in the book, from questioning the credibility of witnesses to presenting doctored evidence. One such piece of evidence, a surveillance video edited to make Sarah appear aggressive, caused an uproar in the courtroom. That video is a lie, Leonard shouted during a recess. We can prove it was tampered with. Rebecca nodded. We will. But we need to stay focused. They're grasping at straws. The prosecution countered with expert testimony, forensic evidence, and Timothy Nguyen's powerful account of Turner's abuses. Timothy's testimony was particularly damning, as he described the culture of fear and complicity within the department. I stayed silent for too long, he said, his voice trembling, but not anymore. It's time to tell the truth. As the trial reached its midpoint, Marcus received a chilling phone call late one night. You think you're a hero? The voice growled. We know where your mother is. Back off, or she won't be safe. Marcus's blood ran cold. He immediately called Leonard, who contacted the police to ensure Sarah's safety. But the incident only strengthened Marcus's resolve. They're scared, he told Leonard, and they should be. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was the audio recordings of Turner bragging about his power. As the recordings played in the courtroom, the mood shifted. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as Turner's words revealed his complete disregard for the people he was sworn to protect. Whitaker attempted to spin the recordings as locker room talk, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions were grim, their eyes fixed on Turner with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Rebecca's closing argument was a call to action. Derek Turner thought he was above the law, she said, her voice rising. But today, we have the power to prove him wrong. This is our chance to send a message to him, to this city, and to every victim who's ever been told their pain doesn't matter. Justice is watching. The jury deliberated for 3 days, the city holding its breath. When the foreman finally announced the verdict, the tension was palpable. On the charge of assault in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of misconduct in office, guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and sobs. Turner's face was a mask of shock and disbelief as officers led him away in handcuffs. Outside, the streets of Elmwood were filled with celebration. Protesters hugged, sang, and chanted, their voices echoing through the night and the weeks that followed. Marcus and his team turned their attention to the systemic reforms that were desperately needed. Policies were changed, corrupt officers were exposed, and the movement Sarah had inspired continued to grow. As Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of thousands, he thought of his mother's words, "This isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. He took a deep breath and spoke. Today, we proved that justice is possible. But the fight isn't over. Together, we will build a future where no one has to live in fear. Together, we will rise. The crowd roared its approval. Their voices a promise of change. The makeshift war room in Marcus Evans' office buzzed with energy. Whiteboards were covered with timelines, connecting Turner's abuses to the systemic failures that enabled him. Stacks of witness statements, affidavits, and police reports spilled across the table. It wasn't just a case, it was a battleground. Leonard Hayes, the seasoned civil rights lawyer, slammed a folder shut. We have enough to bury him. But burying Turner isn't enough. We need to go after the entire system that protected him. Jasmine Carter, the journalist, nodded. This isn't just Turner's trial, it's Elmwood's reckoning. If we win, it'll set a precedent. If we lose, she trailed off, the unspoken consequences weighing heavily on everyone. Timothy Nguyen, the former cop, sat quietly in the corner, his face a mask of guilt. I was part of that system, he said finally. I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. If we expose Turner, it'll open a floodgate, but you need to be ready. The backlash will be massive. Marcus looked at each member of the team, then let the floodgate open. We're not just fighting for my mother, we're fighting for every victim who didn't have a voice. While Marcus's team prepared their case, Turner's allies were mobilizing. Inside the Elmwood Police Department, a culture of fear and loyalty to the Blue Line ran deep. Officers who had covered for Turner for years were now scrambling to protect themselves. Chief Patrick Langston, a man whose polished public image masked decades of complicity, called an emergency meeting. This trial is a direct attack on our department, he said, his voice stern. If Turner goes down, we all go down. Some officers nodded in agreement, their expressions grim. Others shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their past actions, or inaction, hanging over them. A few had even begun quietly cooperating with Marcus's team, their consciences finally outweighing their fear. Turner himself was less composed. Confined to house arrest, he paced his living room like a caged animal, barking orders to his lawyer. Charles Whitaker, they're making me the scapegoat. Turner snarled, you make sure they know I'm not going down alone. Whitaker smirked, don't worry, Derek, we'll hit them where it hurts. The courtroom was a pressure cooker on the first day of the trial. Protesters and counter-protesters clashed outside, their chants and shouts creating a deafening roar. Inside, the tension was palpable. Every seat was filled, and reporters lined the walls, their cameras poised to capture history. The prosecution began with a powerful opening statement. Rebecca Diaz, the sharp and impassioned lead attorney, didn't mince words. This case is about more than one officer's misconduct. It's about the lives destroyed, the trust betrayed, and the abuse of power that has festered unchecked in Elmwood for far too long. Today, we begin to hold those in power accountable. Whitaker's opening statement was equally fiery, but his tone dripped with condescension. He painted Turner as a hard-working officer unfairly targeted by political agendas and media sensationalism. He claimed Sarah Evans had provoked the incident and hinted that the prosecution was using Turner as a scapegoat to distract from larger societal issues. The audience murmured in outrage, but Marcus kept his composure. He knew this was just the beginning. The first witnesses were former victims of Turner's brutality. A young man named Andre, barely out of his teens, recounted being stopped by Turner for looking suspicious while walking home from work. Turner had beaten him so severely that he spent a week in the hospital. Andre's voice shook as he spoke. I thought I was going to die. He kept saying, no one's coming to save you. And he was right. No one did. Whitaker's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Andre's credibility, bringing up minor offenses from his juvenile record. You expect this court to believe the testimony of someone with a history of troublemaking? Whitaker sneered. Andre's eyes filled with tears. But he held his ground. My past doesn't change what he did to me. The courtroom erupted in whispers, a palpable mix of sympathy and outrage. Next was Timothy Nguyen. His testimony was a bombshell. He described how Turner manipulated the system, falsifying reports, intimidating witnesses, and using his connections to bury complaints. I stayed silent because I was scared, Timothy admitted, his voice breaking. But not anymore. Derek Turner isn't just a bad cop. He's a symptom of a corrupt system. Whitaker tried to undermine Timothy's credibility by framing him as a disgruntled ex-officer with a vendetta. But Timothy's sincerity shone through, his guilt and determination striking a chord with the jury halfway through the trial. The defense unveiled a shocking tactic, a fabricated video that appeared to show Sarah Evans acting aggressively toward Turner before the attack. The courtroom gasped as the video played, showing a blurry figure lunging at Turner. "That's not what happened," Marcus hissed to Leonard. Rebecca immediately objected, and a forensic expert was called to analyze the footage. The expert's testimony was damning. The video had been doctored, spliced together from unrelated footage. Whitaker smirked. "An honest mistake," he said, "but the damage was done." The defense's strategy was clear: muddy the waters, sow doubt, and shift blame. As the trial dragged on, tensions in Elmwood reached a boiling point. Protesters marched nightly, demanding justice for Sarah and every victim of police violence. Counter-protesters, many of them Turner's supporters, pushed back with equal fervor. One evening, a peaceful march turned violent when agitators threw rocks at police. Tear gas filled the streets, and chaos erupted. Marcus watched the footage on the news, his heart heavy. "This isn't what my mother wanted," he said to Leonard. "She wanted change," Leonard replied, "and sometimes, change isn't pretty." In a dramatic turn, Jasmine uncovered a key piece of evidence, a series of emails between Turner and Chief Langston. The emails revealed that Langston had actively suppressed multiple investigations into Turner's conduct, instructing officers to lose files and intimidate complainants. "This is it," Jasmine said, handing the evidence to Marcus. "This proves it wasn't just Turner. It was the whole department." The emails were introduced into evidence, sending shockwaves through the courtroom. Rebecca used them to paint a devastating picture of systemic corruption. With Turner as both perpetrator and pawn, Rebecca's closing argument was a masterpiece of passion and precision. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice unwavering. "This trial is about accountability. It's about sending a message that no one, not even those in power, is above the law." Derek Turner thought he could act with impunity. Today, you have the power to prove him wrong. Whitaker's closing argument was equally impassioned but laced with fear-mongering. "If you convict Derek Turner, you're convicting every hard-working officer who puts their life on the line every day. Don't let politics cloud your judgment." The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a charged silence after 3 tense days. The jury returned with a verdict. The foreman stood, his voice steady. On the charge of first-degree assault, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of misconduct, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Turner slumped in his seat, his face pale. Outside, the streets of Elmwood filled with cheers and tears. Justice had been served, but the fight for systemic change was just beginning in the weeks following the trial. Reforms swept through Elmwood. Chief Langston resigned in disgrace, and an independent commission began investigating the department. Sarah Evans became a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring movements across the country. Standing on the courthouse steps, Marcus addressed the crowd. "This isn't the end, it's the beginning. Together, we'll build a world where justice isn't just a dream. Together, we'll rise." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a promise of hope and change. The courtroom's echoing cheers faded into the evening air. But the impact of the guilty verdict against Derek Turner reverberated far beyond Elmwood. For the people who had suffered silently for years, it was more than justice, it was vindication. Turner, once feared as a symbol of unchecked power, was now led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. Outside, Marcus Evans stood with his team on the courthouse steps, watching as the crowd erupted in celebration. Tears streamed down the faces of many who had gathered, victims, their families, and countless others who had felt the weight of systemic oppression. Marcus's mother, Sarah Evans, stood by his side, leaning on her cane but standing tall. Her face, still healing from the assault, bore an expression of quiet pride. But for Marcus, the work was far from over. Justice for Turner was just the first step. The system that had protected him still loomed large, and the community demanded deeper accountability. Marcus knew this fight wasn't one he could walk away from. The sentencing hearing drew just as much attention as the trial itself. The prosecution presented a strong argument for the maximum penalty, highlighting the egregious nature of Turner's actions and the widespread harm he had caused. Derek Turner was not just a man with unchecked power. Rebecca Diaz said in her final statement, "He was a reminder to this community that justice was a privilege, not a right. Today, we ask this court to send a message: no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Turner's defense pleaded for leniency, citing his years of service and the personal hardships he would face in prison. But the judge, a steely-eyed woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, was unmoved. "Derek Turner, your actions were not just a betrayal of your badge but a betrayal of the trust this community placed in you. You used your position to harm, intimidate, and oppress. For these crimes, you will serve 25 years without the possibility of parole." Gasps of relief swept through the courtroom. Turner's expression hardened, his once overbearing confidence replaced by simmering rage. As he was escorted out, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Prison was not kind to Derek Turner. The man who once wielded fear as a weapon now found himself on the receiving end of it. Word of his crime spread quickly among the inmates, and Turner became a target. Stripped of his power, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions in the harshest of ways. At night, in the suffocating solitude of his cell, Turner began to unravel. He replayed the trial in his mind, the faces of his victims haunting him. But while remorse might have softened another man, Turner clung to his bitterness, blaming the system, the media, and even his victims for his downfall. In a rare visit, his lawyer, Charles Whitaker, delivered harsh news. "They're coming for your pension," Whitaker said, "and the department's reopening other cases tied to you. You might not just lose your money, you could be facing additional charges." Turner's world, already shattered, crumbled further. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just losing his freedom, he was losing everything while Turner's life unraveled. Sarah Evans focused on rebuilding hers. Though the physical scars from the attack were healing, the emotional wounds lingered. But Sarah refused to let the assault define her. She returned to the community with a renewed sense of purpose, her resilience inspiring those around her. One day, as Sarah distributed food at the neighborhood center, a young girl approached her. "Ms. Evans, my mom says you're a hero." Sarah knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "I'm no hero, sweetheart. I'm just doing my part. But you," she smiled warmly, "you're going to grow up in a world where heroes look just like you." The community rallied around Sarah, supporting her efforts and celebrating her courage. Murals of her face appeared on walls throughout Elmwood, and her story became a symbol of hope for marginalized communities across the country. For Marcus, the trial was the beginning of a larger fight. He leveraged the momentum from Turner's conviction to push for sweeping reforms. Alongside Leonard Hayes, Jasmine Carter, and other activists, Marcus launched a campaign to address the systemic issues that had allowed Turner to operate unchecked. Their first target was the Elmwood Police Department. The emails uncovered during the trial led to an independent investigation, and Chief Patrick Langston was forced to resign in disgrace. Several officers who had covered for Turner were also fired, and policies were implemented to increase transparency and accountability. But Marcus didn't stop there. He worked with city officials to establish a civilian oversight board, giving the community a voice in police matters for the first time. He also advocated for statewide legislation to address police misconduct, earning national recognition for his efforts. At a public forum, Marcus addressed the crowd with the same conviction he had shown in the courtroom. "This isn't about vengeance," he said. "It's about building a system where justice is real, where people like my mother don't have to live in fear." The changes in Elmwood were slow but undeniable. The protests, once fueled by anger and despair, evolved into celebrations of progress. Local leaders emerged, inspired by Marcus and Sarah's example, and began organizing initiatives to uplift the community. Programs were created to support youth education, housing, and job opportunities. The neighborhood center where Sarah often volunteered became a hub for change, offering resources and services to families in need. One of the most poignant moments came when a young artist unveiled a mural depicting Sarah and Marcus standing side by side, their faces lit with determination. Below them were the words, "We rise together," months into his prison sentence. Derek Turner sent a letter to Marcus. It was handwritten, the penmanship shaky but deliberate. "Judge Evans, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I see now what I refused to see before. I was wrong. I hurt people. People who never deserved it. And for that, I am sorry. I don't ask for mercy. I just hope my punishment can serve as a warning to others like me. Derek Turner, **. Marcus read the letter in silence. His emotions conflicted. He didn't know if Turner's remorse was genuine. But it didn't matter. The letter wasn't for him. It was for a version of Turner who might have chosen a different path if someone had shown him a better way years later. Sarah Evans sat on the steps of the neighborhood center, watching children play in the street. The world hadn't been fixed overnight, but it was better. Elmwood was no longer a place defined by fear and silence. It was a community learning to heal, to grow, to fight for what was right. Marcus, now a prominent advocate for justice reform, joined her on the steps. "You started this," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "We started this, and we're just getting started." As the sun set over Elmwood, their silhouettes against the mural painted a picture of resilience and unity, a testament to the power of courage, justice, and love. The days following Derek Turner's conviction were a whirlwind for Elmwood. While many celebrated, others struggled with the implications of the verdict. For years, Turner had been seen by his supporters as a protector, someone who enforced order in a community they perceived as unruly. His downfall shattered that narrative and laid bare the festering corruption within the Elmwood Police Department. Protests transformed into town hall meetings, and public forums swelled with voices long silenced by fear. Marcus Evans became a central figure, not just as a judge but as a symbol of justice. His mother, Sarah, was hailed as the quiet force that had sparked the movement. Yet, the work was far from over. At a rally in the heart of Elmwood, Marcus addressed the crowd. His voice carried over the sea of faces, a mix of joy, hope, and lingering tension. "This is not the end," he said. "It's the beginning." Derek Turner's conviction is a victory, but it's one battle in a much larger war. Together, we will ensure that no one else suffers the way my mother did. Together, we will rebuild. The crowd erupted into applause. But Marcus knew the fight ahead would test him like never before. Turner's sentencing hearing, weeks after the trial, was as highly anticipated as the trial itself. The courtroom was packed once again, with victims, activists, and reporters all eager to hear how much time Turner would spend behind bars. The prosecution laid out the full scope of Turner's crimes, highlighting not just Sarah's assault but the years of abuse and fear he had inflicted on the community. Rebecca Diaz, the lead prosecutor, delivered a fiery argument. "This sentence is not just about punishing Derek Turner," she said. "It's about restoring faith in the system he so gravely betrayed." Turner's defense team pleaded for leniency, arguing that he had served his community for decades and deserved mercy. But the judge was unmoved. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice firm, "your actions have harmed countless individuals and eroded trust in the institutions meant to protect us. This court sentences you to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole." Cheers erupted from the gallery. But the celebration was tempered by the announcement of new investigations into Turner. Evidence uncovered during the trial pointed to additional crimes, extortion, evidence tampering, and even connections to illegal activities within the department. The deeper the investigation went, the more corruption it unearthed for Derek Turner. Prison was a brutal awakening. Once a man who thrived on fear and control, he now found himself powerless. His reputation preceded him, and other inmates saw his fall as an opportunity to settle scores or make their own reputations. In his first month behind bars, Turner was targeted multiple times, his belongings stolen, his meals sabotaged, and his cell vandalized. Guards turned a blind eye, unwilling to protect a man who had tarnished the badge they all wore. At night, Turner was left alone with his thoughts. The faces of his victims haunted him, their voices echoing in his mind. He began to write letters, apologizing to some of the people he had wronged, though he received no replies. For the first time in his life, Derek Turner was forced to confront the enormity of his actions while Turner grappled with his new reality. Sarah Evans returned to her life of quiet service. Her body bore the scars of Turner's assault, but her spirit was unbroken. She resumed her work in the community, helping families in need and mentoring young people who looked up to her as a beacon of hope. One afternoon, as Sarah walked through the neighborhood with her cane, A teenager approached her. "Ms. Evans," he said shyly, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it changed everything." Sarah smiled gently. "I didn't do it alone. It takes all of us to make change. Remember that." Her humility only deepened the admiration the community felt for her. Murals of her face began appearing throughout Elmwood, alongside phrases like, "Strength in the struggle," and "Justice lives here." While Sarah focused on healing the community, Marcus tackled the systemic issues exposed during the trial. The evidence uncovered against Turner and the Elmwood Police Department revealed a pattern of corruption that went far beyond one man. Marcus worked with local officials to establish a civilian oversight board, a long-overdue reform that gave the community a voice in police accountability. He also pushed for statewide legislation to address police misconduct, joining forces with other activists and lawmakers. But the resistance was fierce. Police unions lobbied aggressively against the reforms, framing them as an attack on law enforcement. Marcus received threats, anonymous letters, phone calls, even a vandalized car, but he refused to back down. At a press conference, Marcus addressed the opposition head-on. "Accountability is not an attack on law enforcement," he said. "It's a demand for integrity. Good officers have nothing to fear from these reforms. But those who abuse their power should be very, very afraid." As the reforms took shape, the community began to see tangible changes. The police department underwent a major overhaul, with several officers resigning or being dismissed as a result of the investigation. New leadership brought a commitment to transparency and rebuilding trust. Youth programs, funded by grants Marcus helped secure, offered opportunities to at-risk teenagers. The neighborhood center where Sarah volunteered expanded its services, becoming a hub for education, job training, and community support. At the center's grand reopening, Marcus and Sarah stood together on the stage, looking out at the crowd that had gathered to celebrate. "This center," Marcus said, "is proof that change is possible when we come together. My mother taught me that. And now, we're teaching the next generation." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the power of unity and resilience. Months into his sentence, Turner sent a letter to Marcus. It was brief, written in shaky handwriting. "Judge Evans, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. For what I did to your mother. For what I did to so many others. I don't expect redemption, but I hope that my punishment will mean something, that it will stop others like me from doing the same. Derek Turner, **. Marcus read the letter in silence. He didn't know if Turner's remorse was genuine or if it was a desperate attempt to salvage some dignity. Either way, Marcus didn't respond. The letter wasn't for him. It was for Turner to reckon with his own conscience years later. Elmwood was a different place. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The scars of its past remained, but they were healing, thanks to the efforts of people like Marcus and Sarah. Sarah, now in her 80s, continued to be a guiding presence in the community. Children flocked to her for stories, and adults sought her wisdom. She had become a living legend, her resilience an inspiration to all who knew her. Marcus, too, had grown into his role as a leader and advocate. His work extended far beyond Elmwood, shaping national conversations about justice and reform. But no matter how far he traveled, he always returned home, to the streets where his journey had begun. One evening, as the sun set over Elmwood, Marcus and Sarah sat together on a bench, watching children play. A mural nearby depicted them side by side, their faces lit with determination. "You've done good, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice soft but full of pride. "We've done good," he corrected, smiling at her. As the laughter of children filled the air, they sat in quiet reflection, knowing that their fight had made a difference, and that their legacy would live on.